Okay.
Yes, you can start.
Okay. Anshika, we are starting. If people join in between, they can keep joining. And in case at any moment of time you need to add something or ask a question, you can stop me or put it in a chat. Can you hear my voice?
Yes,
Can you hear my voice and see the PPT?
yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So today we are talking, we are doing unit 3 of MTI 001 about approaches to diaspora studies. And and in each class, what I typically do is do a tie back to the earlier classes that we had, so that if anybody misses in between, and we'll be able to catch up, as well as it gives a continuity in terms of understanding the concept. So we talked about migration being a permanent and semi-permanent change. We talked about migration being caused by various factors. There are a number of factors. There is never a deterministic way migration happens. There are multiple factors. Also, the fact we've also talked about the fact that the story of human being is a story of migration. We looked at theories of international migration, which has been explained by various social scientists. So, various social scientists in various fields have explained it in their field, in their particular perspective. We looked at some of the theories like neoclassical, new economics of migration, segmented historical social capital human agency approach. Then we looked at what is diaspora, how the diaspora, the concept of scattering, the literal meaning of diaspora came about, and how in the postmodern world the concept has been radically reordered in terms of growing transnationalism. We talked about transnationalism. We looked at the fact that Safran was, the first, one of the first scholars to define diasporas and defined it in six specific ways. They or their ancestors have been dispersed, collective memory, their belief can never be fully accepted in host society, ancestral home is idealized, members of diaspora should be contained, committed to maintenance or restoration of the homeland. And this classical characteristics of diaspora was made looking at the Jewish diaspora. In fact, the diaspora study started with the Jewish diaspora. Subsequently to Safran, Cohen added four additional features. Should include scattering groups, strong connection with the past, defined positively. So the initial classical diaspora definition included victimization and negativity, whereas subsequently Cohen talked about, positivity. Common identity with co-ethnic members. So that is how Cohen brought this out in terms of additional features. Cohen also identified five types of diasporas, and as we talked about, these are not watertight. They can be, movement from one to another. Sorry. So these are the five types of diasporas. Then we looked at transnationalization and globalization. Transnationalization denotes transcending the strict distinction of national boundaries. In fact, both these terms are interrelated, and basically, as the world grew better in terms of communication and transportation, idea again was a free flow of capital, ideas, and people, and complement each other. So both these ideas are interrelated: transnationalization and globalization. Global versus national, transnationalization, subordinating the local and national. See, it was obviously these were going to happen because once people migrated, they settled in host lands, and there was a faster way to come back or a 24 by 7 real time connectivity. uh, then people could, that longing, or that away from home was just opening up, picking up a mobile and connecting through internet. Transnationalism has challenged homogenization, led to repositioning of states, encourages heterogeneity, discourages homogeneity, distinctly different cultures. And this connectivity, with internet and other means of connectivity, has basically brought the there with here and here with there. So there is that, the split between homeland and hostland no longer exists in using connectivity with media as well as transportation. Transnationalism from above, like supranational political and economic. So there is a transnationalism from above, and there's a transnationalism from below, where people are connecting. From above is how these global bodies, are there. Argue that transnationalism affect diverse areas of international governance, interstate politics, foreign policy. Because of this connectivity, today, anything which happens, for example, in India, is automatically transferred to the diasporas all over the world. And anything which affects the diasporas all over the world is immediately transmitted back into India. And it is real time, 24 by 7. It does not take months for information to come. In types of transnationalism, Anderson spoke about transnational political consciousness. Human mobility cannot be viewed as a rupture between here and there. In fact, today, before one migrates, one already knows where they are going, what is the situation there, what is the physical geography, what is the political space, and once the person migrates, the person knows what's happening back at homeland and has various means of coming back. So there is no rupture per se. Globalization, as the widening, intensifying, speeding up, and growing impact of worldwide connectedness. And, because of globalization, anything which happens at one place immediately impacts everywhere. So we saw in 2020, when a pandemic started in China, it quickly spread because people are constantly moving with people. The virus spread, and there was this global pandemic which happened. In theories of globalization, three types of positions: hyperglobalist, skeptics, and transformationists. And then we looked at three types of globalization: economic globalization, cultural globalization, and political. And inevitably, they again feed into each other. Just because business happened, business changes culture, culture also leads to politicization. So there are three types of globalization. So now we come to unit 3 and talk about approaches to diaspora studies. So how are diaspora studies done? Are there any particular ways, concepts and phenomena of diaspora? So diaspora studies the approaches can be multifarious. One way to study diaspora is the historical approach. Examines origin of diaspora's communities, cause of their migration. Focus on historical events: slavery, colonization, colonism, forced displacement, war. One studies diaspora based on history. And we also know that throughout history, there have been various waves of migration from each region, from each country. So in MDI 003, where we look at various types of diaspora, when we were looking at Asian diaspora, there were various waves based on various conditions which existed. So historical approaches looks at that. The next approach is the cultural approach, emphasizes the maintenance and transformation of cultural practices, traditions, identities. How, how, how a new culture comes in, or how does this diasporic community go there and pick up a new culture? Does it assimilate? Does it maintain its own culture? Are there changes in culture? For example, in South Africa, how there is an amalgamation of an Indian cuisine along with an African cuisine into something new. It looks at migrants' adapt their cultural expressions to new environment while keeping ties to their homeland. So that's another approach to study diaspora. The third is political approach. Role of diaspora communities in shaping political landscape, both in home countries and in host countries. Studies of diaspora involvements in transnational politics, activism, and global movement. How does one particular, how does, let's say, the Canadian diaspora affect Indian politics or the American diaspora affect Indian politics? What are the actors which move about? How these particular diasporic community lead to tensions or easing of tensions between two state governments, between two states? That's the political approach. Then there is the sociological approach. Dynamics of diasporic community within their host societies in terms of social structure, networks, integration, and marginalization. Issues such as social cohesion, negotiation of identity, intergenerational differences. There is always a difference also between different generations. So, for example, the first generation of Indians who possibly migrated in the 60s, the professionals, what is happening to the next generation of theirs? Are they as well integrated in the host societies, or the transnationalism is much more stronger? How do they maintain their, how do they negotiate their identities, and so on and so forth? That comes under a sociological approach. And we've already looked at the fact that diaspora studies is an interdisciplinary study. So obviously there are multiple ways to look at diasporas. There is a transnationalism and globalization approach. How diaspora communities maintain connections across national boundaries, create transnational networks of communication, trade, and social. There would be possibly quite some amount of similarity between various diasporas. But there could be, say, for example, the Indian diaspora in US might be engaging differently than the Canadian diaspora or the European diaspora, the European Indian diaspora, or the Australian Indian diaspora. So, if we look at it from the transnational and globalization approach, that's also an approach to diasporic studies. Then there is a question of identity and memory approach. How identity is formed, negotiated. So, for example, the identity and memories of the indentured labor would be way different or marked different from the professionals who migrated and made and had diasporic formations after India got independent. So that would also involve historical, it would also involve political, it also involves identity and memory approach. It explores themes of belonging, home displacement, nostalgia, and memory. Remember, memory is also a very subjective criteria. How does one remember things? So today, for example, social media is a great place for memory formation. But again, remember, every human being perceives any media in their own particular way. So besides identity and memory, there is an economics approach. Looks at financial and labor dynamics of diaspora communities. And that is why, diaspora also has a very close relation with labor. Includes remittances sent by migrant as well economic contribution. What are the effects of these remittances? What are the effects of this migration in terms of economics of a nation, state, or families? How diasporas participate in global trade, labor markets, create new forms of economic exchange, both within in the community and beyond. So that's the economic approach. Besides all these approaches, there is the psychological approach, emotional and mental health, focusing on issues such as trauma, displacement, identity crisis, feeling of alienation. How individuals cope with stress, experience of being minority, challenging to a new. So there was this article in the New York Times about this Chinese girl whose parents emigrated to the US, and she then went via Canada into US, became a US citizen. But she talked about the alienation part of how she was, in spite of the fact she was a US citizen, how she was alienated from, in terms of her culture, in terms of her identity. She could never, be a part of the US society. Then there is the feminist and the gendered approach. Different experiences of diaspora based on gender. A woman looks at migration from a totally different perspective than a man. How it affects how migration affects men and women differently, often challenge traditional gender roles get changed because, for example, in India you have domestic help. In the European or the Western nations, you do not have domestic help. Depends on who has a job or who migrates, shapes gender identities, particularly in terms of labor, family structure, intersectionality of race, class, and gender. There was this wonderful YouTube video about these Kerala nurses, and once they got married, and these traditional Keralite men traveled to Germany, how it was a problem adjusting because the wife was working and then they had to fit in. In fact, there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of, cases of suicide because these men could not adjust themselves. Then there is the intersectional approach. Complexities of identities, considering race, ethnicity, gender, cannot be understood in isolation, but we examine with multiple overlapping systems of power and oppression. One could study diaspora using an intersectional approach, multiple facets. Besides all this, one can look at a class perspective. So different classes when they migrate and come into make diasporic formations, uh, are these classes changing? What about ethnic and religious perspectives? So would the Indian Hindus and the Indian Muslims and the Indian Christians and the Indian Parsis, when they migrate and make a diaspora, what happens there? Linguistic and subnational perspective. What about the Punjabi diaspora? What about the Telugu diaspora, the Tamil diaspora? How do they interact? And then there is a national perspective. The Indian diaspora, the Pakistani diaspora, the Bangladesh diaspora, and what happens to the people who migrated before the subcontinent was partitioned? What happens to them? How do they negotiate their identities? So let's dwell a little bit more into, for example, class, variety of classes within broad communities, their composition, destination countries, resourcefulness, transnational engagement. Classes of have not only different level of access to culture, linkages and resources, but role of home and host countries towards them. And inevitably, human communities are never homogeneous. Religious communities are also not homogeneous. National communities are also not homogeneous. There are subsections, there are subdivisions, further subdivisions. How do these interact into with each other? What happens when diaspora formation happens? In ethnic and religious approach, cultural identity plays an important role. Religion and ethnicity is a part of the cultural identity. Ethnicity is not a rigid one. Often places of religious practices, for example, in Hong Kong, places of religious activities, for example, of Hindus and Sikhs are shared, and many places. And all these identities are very fluid. And remember, we have been talking about the fact that when people are there in the host society, uh, basically they look at negotiating what is the best for them. Each successive migration flow and demographic composition, freedom of space available in host redefine the nature of diasporic experience. So today, for example, if conditions become such, for example, a new government is coming in the US, a government which has been formed on the basis of immigrants as a problem area, you will see diasporas then lobbying, coming together, lobbying for their rights. If there is a high case of racism, then how this movement happens in terms of politics and otherwise, it happens. Then there is linguistic and subnational approach are of regional and linguistic level, for example, Telugu diaspora, Gujarati diaspora, Tamil diaspora, how they jostle for political space. So, for example, Indian American from the Gujarati diaspora is part of the new administration in America. How do the other diaspora handle this? How do they negotiate? What is happening? So, that is an approach which is also taken. The nationalist approach, the nation or nationality, is very core of diasporic identity. And remember, at the end of the day, nation is nothing but an imagined community. Long distance nationalism is a means of strengthening ethnic identity. Why would the presidential candidate in the US election talk about her blackness or her Indian background? That is how they look at in terms of identity and engaging with other diasporic communities. Globalization, which is further amplified by digital technology, provides more varieties of interactive with the peer groups, community of the same ethnicity, nationality, etc. That's the way one negotiates, identity. That's the way one negotiates their existence, and so on and so forth. So there is the nationalist approach. Anderson talks about long distance nationalism as an action of diasporic groups in terms of how they affect the politics of their country of origin without actually being there. What is typically happening with American diasporas trying to, come on social media and talk about how, Indian elections or the Indian government affects them. They want to have a say. In fact, a lot of Indians wonder why these people who have, different citizenships now want to talk about the Indian politics. But that's how this is the long distance nationalism. Digital and social media allows participation in the range of political activities, online campaign, fundraising, lobbying. And we have seen this is only growing because as transnationalism grows, as communication and transportation becomes better, as there is easy access to capital, to money movement, this will only grow. Is not a new phenomena. Mexicans, Armenians, Indians, Hungarians, Irish have already practiced long distance. The only thing was earlier, it used to, the messages and the coming back used to take time. Today, with faster means of transportation, with 24 by 7 connectivity, it's a real time connection back home. Then there is the political economy. The rise of Asian nations as news power has changed their diasporic relations. With Indians contributing such a high level of remittances, they feel it is their right to influence the national politics. The rise of national movements and rise of economic and political clause also further accentuate the politicization of diasporas. So, there is this back and forth movement of politics, of political ideas, of engagement, of activism, and so on and so forth. Diasporic social formation has consolidated. New elites and political entrepreneurs aspire to become leaders, which is why you will see there is, the Western diaspora, the Western Indian diaspora takes great interest today in Indian elections. Not only national elections, but state elections, state diasporas come in. They contribute to political parties. They want to. There is an active movement to try and get the diaspora a vote in the. Currently, it's not there in a lot of places. For example, the Turkish diaspora today can vote in the Turkish elections. So obviously, when you are able to vote, you have an influence. relation with governments of the new countries of settlement as well as with the governments of former homelands. So, if you see, the Indian diaspora is very strongly entrenched in the US politics, in the Canadian politics, in European politics, because that is the way they are able to push their heft into their hostlands. So, if you look at it, this is the Malayali Association of Federation of Malayali Associations of Americas, uh, and when the CM of Kerala is visiting, this is their website. They have put out interaction with the CM. Obviously, it is for it is for mobilization, it is for influencing politics back home, it is for bringing out new political elites. There is a email, there is a call, there is a calendar, they have regions, they have councils, they have committees, they do philanthropic work back in homeland, they do other kinds of work in homeland, and they are connected in all matters of speaking. Homeland governments are crafting entitlements ranging from dual or special citizenship status, elections for position in homeland. India still does not have it, though a lot of other countries now are looking at engagement of diasporas this way. Keeping the diaspora productively engaged as subordinates. Remember, the simplest is the remittance in terms of economics, but there are so many other ways which diasporas today contribute into homelands. Then there are global events. For example, 9/11 changed the perception of many host countries towards immigrants. The Syrian civil war, which led to a lot of migrants from Syria and the Middle East into Europe, got a backlash in against immigrants in Europe. There has been a backlash in America regarding immigrants. There is a backlash happening in Canada regarding immigrants. Many anti-immigration movements and xenophobic attacks. We also need to understand all these things happen parallelly with the fact that most of these countries need immigrants to run their economy. They don't have manpower or labor to run their country. So all these things happen parallelly. Then social media today becomes a great factor in influencing approaches towards diaspora. There are about 57% of the global population using social media, and social media is a way which passes the good and the bad in real time. Communities all over the world are well networked today than ever before. Anything which happens at home is immediately transmitted to the diasporic communities in hostland, and anything which happens in the hostland is transmitted back home, which affects politics, which affects a relation between nation states. Typically, we saw there was a souring of relation between India and Canada based on the Indian diasporic community and the Indian government, and so on and so forth. And this affected, diplomatic relations. Diverse range of interaction among communities originating from some other countries, forming social media, communities, media, internet, and other digital transformed diasporic communication practices. And today, for example, earlier culture used to get formulated at home and transmit out. Today, there are ways cultural construction happens or cultural formulation happens in diasporic communities, and they travel back home. So this every aspect of engagement happens both ways. The academic approach to study diaspora has changed over time. There are two different ways to study to view these approaches. One is the idealistic notion of diaspora. In fact, the whole studies of diaspora started with the classical or idealistic notion of diaspora with Jews as the focus, which subsequently was enhanced to engage Armenians and the African diaspora. Diaspora is perceived as a community that is victimized. Formation of diaspora is due to violence and pain, and diaspora is considered as a loss of homeland. This was the idealistic or the classical notion of diaspora. Uh, and this classical notion is static, does not take in account of dynamic. It's like saying that a community is frozen in time, which we all know does not happen. No community is frozen in time. And especially today with globalized dynamics of globalization forces or globalized forces, evolution of nation states, experience of communities through globalized forces such as social media, political economy, and other factors. But the idealistic notion talks about a static community, a static way of looking at things. Present day approach includes migrants, refugees, widely used over. So nowadays, mostly people do not use the idealistic or the classical approach. All deterritorialized communities come under the umbrella of diaspora. In fact, it all depends on which scholar and what perspective. So, diaspora, whenever the term diaspora is used, one has to look at as who's saying it in what context. There is no, specific or idealized way to call diasporas. Saffron, we have seen, was the earliest one, identified six major, defined diaspora as a framework for study of a specific process. Westovec identified three general meanings of diaspora. Diaspora as a social form, diaspora as a consciousness, and diaspora as a mode of cultural production. In fact, that is also a way diasporas can be studied or diasporas can be defined. So, if you look at diaspora as a mode of cultural production, then possibly, people or people who came from the undivided India uh, and the present day Pakistan into India are diasporas as a social form. It could be a social form or it could be a consciousness. So that, how you are defining it. So let's look at these three in a little more elaborate form. Diaspora is a social form, experience of the Jews, negative connotation to the idea of diaspora, forced movement, victimization, loss, which later applied to Armenian and African diaspora. Whereas diaspora as a consciousness constitute uh, can be recreated through the mind, cultural artifacts, and through shared imagination. So, how you how do you define yourself? So, for example, the indentured community or the indentured labor from India who was taken to, let's say, Suriname or Guyana, how did they imagine or they remember as a consciousness? How did they remember India? So they carried some cultural artifacts, they carried religious symbols. Some of them still maintain those rituals as a part of the consciousness. And whereas that is why they say that some of the Indians in the West seem to carry traditions which even the Indians in India do not follow because their consciousness still is of the time when they traveled, when they migrated. Whereas Indians in India and the concept of India and the culture of India itself has moved. So social form of consciousness and as a mode of cultural production. A conception of identity which does not even fade after hybridity is constantly producing, reproducing culture through transformation and difference. Again, because human being like a community and similarly like a community is not static. Nobody is static. You're constantly changing. You are coming in contact with other people. You are coming in contact with situations. There is an experience which you go through, and that experience leads to a change. So for example, example of this is, look at this, the movie Namesake. This movie has been directed by Meera Nair, who's a diaspora, an Indian diasporic community. The book of from on which this movie was made was written by Jhumpa Lahiri, again an Indian diaspora. And the movie is about identity. It's about a Bengali couple who goes and stays in the US, and it tells about Gogol Ganguly, the son of an Indian immigrant, as he navigates his cultural identity between his Bengali heritage and American life. And it's not only in terms of cultural production, it also is able to get a perspective in terms of how difficult it is to negotiate this cross cultural in terms of a individual's identity. It is very easily said that assimilation can happen, and they have a good quality of life, but at the end of the day, a human being as well as a community, the core is an identity. How does the individual or the community negotiate the identity between that culture and this culture, the culture they have grown up into and the culture they are now living? In fact, this conflict happens not only in the first generation immigrant, but also in subsequent generation. So Kamala Harris might be an American, but she would still need to explain her Indianness in terms of her parents being Indian, or her mother being Indian and a father being a black African. How does she negotiate? And still in the US elections, questions were asked: Is she Indian? Is she black? That becomes, various ways how you negotiate. So means of cultural production. Home in the case of diaspora is always ambiguous and incomplete. What do you define as home? So, for example, in namesake, do the Gangulis who traveled from Calcutta to the US define Calcutta as a home, or where they are staying in the US is their home? It's never fixed and permanent, as the ideal perception of the home assumes it to be private, safe, fixed, and a shelter to return to. Idealization of home does not correspond to any kind of home anywhere in the late modernity, because you're constantly moving, where symbolic and real boundaries of space and privacies are blurred. So you might be living in America, but you might still feel home as Kolkata. So, for example, uh, let's look at the fact that the Canada today, Canada has the largest Sikh population out of Punjab, but on some level, all these Sikhs in Canada, which constitute about 2% of the population, still consider Punjab as their home, and they come at for weddings, they come for family functions, and so on and so forth. Questions, Massey questions the stable and inward-looking nature of the home and argues that a sense of place does not depend on its stability and purity, depends on its unique position as a point of intersection in a wider context of relation. Nostalgia, strangeness, and a sense of loss intensifies the effort of making a house a home. This is not just going across national boundaries, it is even going across within the national boundaries. So let's say you are traveling from Rai Bareli into Delhi. What would you define as home? You would normally say home is Rai Bareli, not Delhi. So that is how and once and within the national boundaries, there is some elements of culture which is still recognizable, but when you cross national boundaries, you are going into a culture which is so alien, and then you are trying to negotiate and figure out what is happening. Because diaspora is constantly search for a place where it will reconstruct its past, imaginary future, identities, roles, rituals, and beliefs. That's what makes a human being complete. Gilroy and Clifford have paved the way for decisively non-essentialist understanding of diaspora, which focuses on migrants, cross-border linkages, flows and circulation, and practices of establishing social and symbolic sign. And that is why the transnational these linkages become strong, because inevitably the diaspora, even after having made a host land in terms of citizenship, they still have all the relatives, all the connections back home in terms of practices, in terms of social and symbolic ties. and uh, the transnationalism allows them to maintain and and grow those ties. Rather than relying on notion of fixed connection to places, identities, and culture, we now see diasporas as communities that are constantly negotiated and constituted. People, typically Indians have migrated to Africa. From Africa, they have moved on to Canada. For example, the Anita Anand, who's a front runner in terms of the Canadian politics, her parents were Indians who were in Nigeria and then went to Canada. There were physicians who, made Canada their home where Anita was born. She's an Indian and the first Indian, Hindu Indian who is front leading in the Canadian politics, as was the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Chiang observed in the 20th century the upward mobility, irresistible flow of capital, information technology, and people destabilized the traditional identity paradigm. And now, more and more of this is happening. A static sense of nation state based cultural identity. So, everything is on the move because there is so much of mobility is constant, migration is constant. And that's why today, diaspora studies or diasporic studies or defining a diaspora becomes that much more complicated. So he identified two contradictory movements: the mobility and replacement of our bodies destabilize a traditional sense of identity that was usually deeply rooted in the sense of nation state. So today, for example, India is not within the nation state of India or the national boundaries of India. India is wherever you are. Wherever you are having those connections is India. Localism or nativism simultaneously increases as a reaction and resistance to global forces. So, what is happening in America typically, irrespective of the fact the whole America is are migrants, are immigrants, the natives of America have practically been erased by the European immigrants who came out there. Now these immigrants, Donald Trump is an immigrant. His wife is an immigrant. The person leading the Democrat Party was is an immigrant. Everybody is an immigrant, and the U.S. politics is played against anti-immigration. So this is a reaction and resistance to global forces by the locals, from the locals. Now, again, who defines what is the local? Who defines, for example, in India, a lot of communities came from outside. For example, interestingly, the Jats, one of the theories is the Jats came to India from Central Asia. Who is local? Who's an immigrant? Who is not an immigrant? So these are contradictory movements. There is continuous mobility, and then there is a reaction. The praise-related analytical model and longing to return is no more central to the diasporic imagination, which was the classical or the idealist concept of diaspora. Longing to return. There is no longing because everybody is on the move. Imagination as a continuous process of creating and recreating a shared diasporic space of dreams, fantasies, and visions. So maybe four generations, three generations, or four generations of Indian Americans, they might have communities like, for example, Chinatowns all over the world. They are as much China as what they would be in China. So diasporic imagination itself is a continuous process. Diasporic imaginary emerges at the intersection of global transnationalism and renationalism. Interconnectedness with the nourished by both globe. So, how are you imagining things? How are you imagining a home? Or how are you imagining a homeland? And the consciousness of belonging to a global community and the national imaginary. So, are you a global citizen? Are you looking at imagination of an Indian in India, or are you, for example, we people sitting in India today are almost connected globally. We know what is happening everywhere in terms of global events. We are those news are beamed onto us. It's a construction of shared ideas and ideologies within a nation. So what is happening? So for example, the Sikhs in Canada today have made Canada home. They have their places of worship. They are into politics of Canada. They are doing their businesses out there. They are the one of the biggest communities of Sikhs out. They are the biggest community of Sikhs outside India, and yet they maintain those links to Punjab. So let's sum up this unit. Diasporas are heterogeneous groups based on their historical experience, location, and other factors, carry variety of subjective experiences and meanings of ethnicity, race, gender, four major approaches, classes. You can study diasporic in terms of sociological, economic, memory, political, and so on and so forth, but also in terms of class, ethnic perspective, linguistic, subnational perspective. As a subject study needs more nuanced approach, there are also diasporas who have conflicting interests with home countries, and often the relationship is violent. Uh, I picked up, as I said, in each class, I look at, if there are any academic, links or articles which can be tracked. So if you go on Google, Springer Nature Link, there is this thing, there's this journal on diasporic studies. The land left behind, a systemic review of transnational migration induced change and its implication for rural sustainability in Nepal. So these particular authors are looking at what happens to when these people migrate, what happens to the land, how does things change back home in communities, because every movement leads to some change. What is that change which happens? What is the change which happens on the migrant? What is the change which happens on the people left behind? What is the change which happens on the land which is left behind by these migrants, and so on and so forth? So then there's a JSTOR article. If you're able to access JSTOR, or if you have somebody who can access JSTOR, novel approaches to understanding and conceptualizing diaspora. This is Hungarian Journal of English and American Studies. This is a particular article published by Sindo. So you can search this out. There are some references in your unit itself. There is Marco, Brian Keith, there is Avatar, Cartographies of Diaspora, and so on and so forth. I think I have come to the end of the presentation. Okay. If there is any questions that you wish to ask. Hi, guys. Any questions that you wish to ask, or anything that you wish to add? Yeah, Aisha, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just thinking about the book recommendations that you made.
Huh.
Um, if you can, let me know of any fictional books that I can read that will
Okay.
hold my attention. I really would love to.
This book on which this movie Namesake was made by is by Jhumpa Lahiri. There are a lot of diasporic filmmakers, authors who are writing about the diaspora experience. In fact, every person, every diasporic person, or every person who has migrated, if you talk to them, or if you find out about their story and see their experience, you will find every story is unique in its own particular way, because based on gender, based on where they migrated, based on when they migrated, based on the reason why they migrated, or the job for which they migrated, has a unique story. So there
There,
was, yes, Anishka.
there are one book of Saadat Hasan Manto, Toba Tek Singh. It is very good on the migration and partition. And then there is the book of House of Spirit. This is also very good book.
Anishka, Tauba Tek Singh is a partition literature actually about how the partition, displaced people. And see, again, need to understand, partition is something. There was this Indian subcontinent where there is still, if you see, there is a very similar culture between Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Now suddenly there is somebody who comes and draws a line and says these are two countries. This is this side. This is this side. How does human beings negotiate that? So partition is similar to, in fact, a lot of authors use the movement after partition as diasporic formations. There are a lot of people in India or a lot of people in Pakistan who long for going back, because a lot of people just packed up and overnight came to India, and a lot of people packed up and overnight went into what is called the state of Pakistan. It was a diasporic movement in a way. It was a violent movement.
I
I,
recently heard about how some people had like in Karachi, a lot of people had like they migrated from Mumbai and they left their houses, they left everything because they thought this partition is going to be a temporary thing and they're going to get to go back to their houses, resume their way of life. And yeah, it turned out that they never could.
yeah, this happened both ways. And see, look at the fact, a particular political event disturbed the life of so many millions and millions of people.
Sir, sorry to disturb you.
No, no, Anshika, bolo.
Uh, la, I think yesterday I was watching a video on this migration and partition, and then there was the teacher who said if the partition will not happen, suppose then the India will become the land of civil wars, and then that will affect people in a very different or horrific way, because there are still tension going on between these two communities in our country. But the partition never happened, then the land India will become a land for civil war. Sir, what do you think about that?
Anshika, as we have been talking about the fact, not to comment on the political part of it, as we have been speaking, and I don't think so, not just in this unit, but in every unit, no community is homogeneous. So if you take a community based on ethnicity, that also is subdivided based on class, based on region. If you take a community based on religion, religion itself is subdivided into various sects, classes, and so on. So let's look at a very small religion like Sikhism. Sikhism, in fact, is a small, the number of people following the Sikhism religion is relatively much smaller than the bigger global religions. But the fact is, Sikhism itself is subdivided. Islam is subdivided. Hinduism is subdivided. Now, inevitably, what happens is, because each community is subdivided into various, identity formations, at any moment of time, this could lead to conflict based on politicization or mobilization by politicians. So when we say that it would lead to civil war or it would not lead to civil war, look at Sudan. Sudan is predominantly, ethnic formations. There is a fight between North Sudan and South Sudan. You look at Yemen, and it's not about India. It's about, look at Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine was a past part of the larger USSR. So understand one thing, a large part of these tensions rise because of politics, because of politics of identity, political mobilization, and inevitably there would be some factors which will come based on unjust, what you call resource allocation, or the politics of identity always leads to conflict. So if this is not the case, then there would have been some other case. So I don't think so. We should go by these notions. Ke this will happen if partition would not have. This is a very deterministic way or a reductionist way to understand a larger thing which is happening. Anshika?
Yes, sir, I got that.
So वो कुछ ना कुछ, because there is an identity. Remember, whenever politics is there, as I gave the example, the whole country of US is based off immigrants, is based our people are immigrants. The country US is was made by immigrants. The European immigrants who came to the US, they removed or they exterminate or they killed the local population. There are very few Native Americans who are still there. All these are immigrants. Now these immigrants have come and said immigration is bad. Donald Trump himself is an immigrant. Kamala Harris herself is an immigrant. Everybody is an immigrant. But the politics, the identity politics is talking about the fact that immigration is bad. And also, we know the whole US economy works out of immigrants. The whole technical industry of America is Indians and Chinese. So, are you going to throw out all of them? If you are, how does your economy work? So, at some level, they understand. But because there is a politics of identity politics, all these things come in and negotiation happens. And these reductionist statements come in that, oh, if this would not have happened, this would have. It does not happen that way. There are multiple other factors which come in more often than not in your life itself. You see, there are always multiple factors which are influencing your decision making. And you might ascribe it to one predominant factor that is a determinist approach, but inevitably there are multiple factors which work. That is the way it happens with communities also. Anshika,
Yes, sir.
anything else, Asha, Aisha?
No, sir, I was just asking for book recommendations on this
Yeah.
subject.
So if anyone has any book recommendation, you can put it on the WhatsApp group. If there are PDF versions available online, you can put that also. Because last time I did share a book, and I one of the I think Anshika only or somebody else, I think Anshika only shared. She was able to find the PDF versions and put it on the WhatsApp group. So,
Yes.
this WhatsApp group also is a great way of sharing information and resources, and it's in a way a networked society that we are forming. We are, in fact, this is a transnational connections that we are having because we are sitting at different places and we are connected and sharing information.
So the book Your House Will Pay was actually good. I have read three chapters and the story is very nice.
I'm
It's
so
about
glad. I'm
Korean American people.
I'm so glad you liked it. So whenever I come across any resources, I share it, and so should you all. Because once you share it, you can share it in the group, you can share it among each other. That way, you are getting multiple perspectives and actually utilizing this particular course.
So now I will look for the Jhumpa Larry's book. I heard she wrote very nice stories
Huh.
about the migration and all.
Absolutely, absolutely. There are a lot of today diasporic writers who write wonderful stories, and because they have experienced this, remember, literature is always a part of the context in which the author is there. So this diasporic media are a great way to understand what the diaspora is going through. Great. So if there are no more questions, we will call it a day. You will meet me tomorrow at 5 o'clock. We will do unit 25 of MDI 003. Have a nice evening and a great Sunday, and see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock.